Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for our online media briefing in advance of New York Climate Week. We've gathered an incredible panel of experts today to share how momentum is growing for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, a bold plan to foster international cooperation to advance a fast and fair transition to clean energy and other low-carbon solutions. My name's Sephora Berman. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam First Nations in Vancouver, Canada. I'm the founder and chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are from around the world, we will have time for a Q&A session. So I invite you, as we go along with our speakers, to put your questions for Q&A in the chat in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being translated simultaneously, so please now choose at the bottom of your screen interpretation, English if you need English, Spanish if you need Spanish. That way you'll be able to follow along. The campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty was inspired by other treaties that address the threats of landmines, of asbestos, ozone-depleting chemicals, and other dangerous threats. When we know we have a problem, like oil, gas, and coal, driving more than 85% of the carbon emissions that are currently trapped in our atmosphere, causing the fires, the increase in extreme weather and floods that are sweeping the planet today, we know we have to stop making the problem bigger. A year ago, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty was officially proposed for the first time on the floor of the United Nations by the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu, followed by Tuvalu at COP27. Since then, the proposal is quickly gaining momentum with a bloc of 6 Pacific Island nations actively leading a global effort to make it a reality. These governments were very recently followed with an especially weighty endorsement by the state of California. In this crescendo of international cooperation, the movement for a fossil fuel treaty stands stronger than ever, appearing as a testament to the power of collective action. Only 3 years after the launch of the initiative at New York Climate Week, the support for the treaty proposal is growing, with near 100 cities that have passed motion endorsing the call for the treaty, over 2,500 civil society organizations joining the movement around the world to call for the treaty, hundreds of health and faith organizations, including the World Health Organization, including cardinals from the Vatican, nearly 1 million individuals, including Nobel laureates, 3,000 leading academics, scientists, hundreds of Indigenous youth groups, hundreds of Indigenous leaders, youth groups, artists, and musicians, and other influencers who all understand the imperative of this crucial moment. Today, we're going to hear from a fantastic panel consisting of civil society and Indigenous leaders and elected leaders to hear about the growing political support for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty and pathways to achieve a treaty, both within and outside the United Nations processes moving forward. Led by the Pacific countries of Vanuatu and Tuvalu, these first mover countries are advancing diplomatic dialogues in new forums, including discussions regarding achieving a fossil-free Pacific zone and a fossil-free Amazon. They will be demanding others join them when in New York next week for the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretary General's Ambition Summit, and New York Climate Week. For more than 30 years, governments have been negotiating and negotiating international agreements, signing climate agreements that don't address the core problem of oil, gas, and coal. It's like speeding towards an edge of a cliff and thinking that making a commitment in the future to slow down will avoid catastrophe. The IEA made clear that there can be no new fossil fuel projects if we're to achieve the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet, countries' expansion plans currently will result in 110% more production of fossil fuels by 2030 than can ever be burned under a 1.5-degree scenario. With civil society pressure and governments coming together around the proposal for a fossil fuel treaty, we're starting to see some progress being made within the international negotiations. At least the F words are finally on the table. Now is the time to move from vague references about phasing out unabated fossil fuels to clear commitments and plans for international cooperation to accelerate a fair global shift to clean energy, to end the expansion of fossil fuel production and wind down existing production in order to ensure humanity can survive and even thrive in the future. I'm very excited to introduce you to our amazing panel and dive into the conversation about the Fossil Fuel Treaty and ways that you can get involved in this growing movement. Schedules are tight in the run-up to Climate Week, so we have people coming and experts coming in and out of this briefing. Here are the list of who we believe will be joining us, and we'll have to dance quickly on our feet as they come in and out. Honorable Seve Panau, the Minister of Finance and Economic Development for the government of Tuvalu, one of the first countries to call for a fossil fuel treaty. He has a long history of climate leadership, including acting as Sustainable Development Advisory to the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. Christine Boyle. Councillor Christine Boyle was elected to Vancouver City Council in 2018 as a member of One City Vancouver. She's passionate about tackling inequality, contributing to climate solutions, and deepening democratic engagement. Brianna Fruin is a climate change activist who's been leading grassroots community projects, pushing for climate justice since learning about the effects of climate change and noticing the subtle changes to her island of Samoa as a child. Now she sits on the Council of Elders for the Pacific Climate Warriors as the youth representative and continues her efforts to bring young Pacific voices into the climate space. Luisa Fernando Fernandez is a feminist and lawyer from the Universidad Libre with a master's in mining, energy, and petroleum policy at the Universidad Externado de Colombia. Luisa is a member of the Energy and Climate Justice team from Sensat Agua Viva with experience in legal and pedagogical support in processes of defense of the territory and communities that are victims of extractive projects. Eric Lyunguna is a youth climate and environmental activist from Fridays for the Future Kenya. They work with youth across the globe to demand urgent climate action for world leaders. Lyunguna started their climate activism in 2017 after severe droughts in Nairobi impacted their school's water supply by organizing with the group 0 Hour and then Fridays for the Future Kenya. Ariel Derringer is a Denisulian mother from the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, an Indigenous-led climate justice organization in so-called Canada. Derringer is a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and sits on various boards, including Bioneers, It Takes Roots, Leadership Council, Climate Justice Resiliency Fund of Advisors, and WWF Canada, and was a founding member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Tom Goldtooth is the executive director of the Indigenous Environment Network. Tom has been a leading changemaker for the past 40 years as a changemaker and has taken the local issues of the rights of Indigenous peoples related to environmental protection of land, water, air, and health to national and international levels. Recently, Tom contributed to the co-formation of the United Frontline Table and its people's orientation to a regenerative economy. Nikki Reich is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law, where she works at the intersection of human rights and the environment, addressing climate change, its causes, consequences, and responses to it. Thomas Joseph Swanalden, who I believe may be joining us today, is the carbon pricing educator at Indigenous Environmental Network. Thomas campaigns to ensure Indigenous peoples' lands and rights are included in treaties concerning carbon trading. So let's get right into it with this incredible panel. Pacific Island nations were among the first to draw the world's attention to the risks of climate change and the urgent need to act. In 2015, they were the countries that first called for a phase out of fossil fuels. Last year, Vanuatu and Tuvalu brought the demand for a fossil fuel treaty to the UN. and have inspired the creation of a bloc of Pacific Island countries that have rallied together around the Port Vila Declaration. I don't think the minister has joined us yet, so I'm going to go straight to you, Brianna. Brianna, can you, Pacific Island nations have been active at UN meetings for decades, and in fact, the leadership from the Pacific Island nations brings us the ICJ decision, brings us some of the critical issues. We wouldn't have a 1.5 degree Celsius goal without Pacific Island nations. Next week, at Climate Week and at the UNGA and at the UNSG Summit. Can you tell us some more about the steps that might be taken within these UN meetings, as well as any other diplomatic efforts underway outside of the UN halls, such as the diplomatic dialogues that are going to be taking place? Thank you. And can you give us a sense of the work that's been done by civil society and youth in the region to support these developments? And what are your plans moving forward? Thank you so much. I'll never forget that day in Vanuatu during the Port Vila meetings when the youth organized those protests to encourage the ministers to be as bold as possible in those ministerial meetings. And It was, for those of you who don't know, the historic moment of the Port Vila call happened 2 weeks after Vanuatu was hit with two back-to-back cyclones. The country was still in a state of emergency when the ministers welcomed us to the region, and the youth, school children, went into the ocean and offered the ministers a rope and asked them whether they were going to do everything they could to pull them out. And it was one of the most moving things I have ever experienced. And speaking to a number of the ministers as we went back into the ministerial meetings, they were so clear that this was their mandate. And minister, one of the ministers turned to me at that time and said, "See, Sephora, this is why we know that despair is not an option, that every ton of carbon matters, and it matters to our future, and it matters to our children." It was incredibly inspiring. I'm going to ask staff to put a link for everyone to the Port Vila call. It's one of the strongest statements ever by nation states on climate change, and the link between fossil fuels and stopping the expansion of fossil fuels, and meeting our climate goals. I want to turn now briefly to local and subnational and regional initiatives. I'm very proud, as someone who lives in Vancouver, to say that the City of Vancouver was the first jurisdiction in the world to endorse the call for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 2020. This has inspired other local governments to follow suit around the world. And we now have 100 cities that have joined the call, representing communities in every continent in the world, from London to Los Angeles to Calcutta. This is critical, given the role that local governments can play in advocating for action at higher levels of government and normalizing the call for the phase out of fossil fuels in conversations and actions at the local level. And in some ways, in a lot of ways, I'm old enough to remember the nuclear non-proliferation movement and the role that cities played in encouraging our governments on nuclear non-proliferation. And it's part of why I'm so inspired by this. Councillor Boyle, thank you for joining us. I know what a crazy day this is for you. I wanted to ask you why you and other city councillors were compelled to bring forward a resolution on calling for a fossil fuel treaty, and what role do you feel local governments can play in this critical moment in history in pressuring national governments to act, especially, of course, you're coming from a country where just yesterday, due to the incredible report put out by Oil Change International, we now know exactly where the planned expansion of oil and gas on the planet is in the next 5 to 10 years. And it was honestly embarrassing for me as a Canadian to see that the US and Canada plan the greatest expansion of oil and gas, new projects right now than any other place on Earth. So we have our work cut out for us in Canada. It was a very bold and an important statement that Vancouver made. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking and the role of the city? Thank you so much. And do you want to? I know that Vancouver is taking other significant steps to address the risks associated with fossil fuels. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the key initiatives that you have moving there in Vancouver? Fantastic. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us. Maybe I can ask folks to from Treaty Group to put a link to the Stand.Earth Safe Cities program, which is connecting with counselors and staff in cities across North America to help them develop fossil fuel policies to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. Learning a lot from the leadership of Vancouver. We've also seen, thank you, Councillor Boyle. I know you may need to drop off to your other meeting. We really appreciate you joining us today. We've also seen some incredible action and support from subnational governments for a fossil fuel treaty with the state of California, the largest economy in the world, joining us just this month, endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Senator Gonzalez wanted to join us today. Unfortunately, her schedule does not allow it. She is the senator from the 33rd District of California, located in Los Angeles, who sponsored the resolution, and she has sent me a statement to read out today, which I'll read out to you now. With the recent publication of the first stocktake of the Paris Agreement, revealing just how far countries around the world have to go to reduce emissions, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is important now more than ever. I was proud to author Senate Joint Resolution 2 this year and want to express sincere appreciation to my colleagues in the Senate and the Assembly for voting for this important measure. The science has been clear for decades. Fossil fuels are responsible for the climate crisis. It is essentially that we commit once and for all to ending our reliance on fossil fuels, and that's why I'm proud that California is now the world's largest economy to sign on to the proposed Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I want to thank the Treaty Initiative for your hard work on this issue, as well as Stand.Earth, Safe Cities, and the Indigenous Environment Network for your support of SJR2. Our nation must continue to lead by example and advocate on a global scale in order to reach the level of change we need to prevent further harm to our communities and the planet. Let's move together towards a fossil fuel free future. So that was from Senator Lena Gonzalez in California. I think it's possible that we currently have Minister Seve on, but potentially logged on under someone else's name. So I just want to see, Minister Seve, if you're there, can you unmute yourself? All right. In the background, folks will keep trying to reach the minister. In the meantime, I'm going to keep moving here. So as mentioned, Vancouver really got the ball rolling when it came to generating government support for a fossil fuel treaty, with many subnational governments joining them. Likewise, efforts underway in the Pacific have inspired action in other regions of the world. Leaders in Colombia have begun calling for a fossil fuel phase out and a free zone in the Amazon. Dialogues are underway to advance negotiations. The same is true in the continent of Africa, where leaders are coming together around a call for development based on clean energy and low carbon solutions versus dangerous, unhealthy, extractive fossil fuels. Eric, I think I see you there. I'm wondering if you can talk about the diplomatic dialogues underway in Africa and what's planned for New York. Thank you so much, Eric. Is incredibly well said, and of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say here today on this media briefing that our hearts go out, of course, to the people in Libya, the families that are experiencing the incredible extreme floods right now, especially with so many people still missing. It's these real world impacts that are happening every day right now around the planet that we know are connected to the amount of fossil fuels that we're allowing to get trapped into the atmosphere. And we need to use, I think, this moment as we walk into the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretary General Summit, to make that connection between the decisions that elected officials, especially in the wealthy countries like President Biden, like Prime Minister Trudeau, are making today to expand fossil fuel production when we're already seeing these devastating impacts around the planet, and especially in many countries in the global south. Louisa, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the efforts that are happening in Colombia. We've seen so much interesting news happening out of Colombia around fossil fuels and fossil fuels phase out. There's a lot of efforts to build political support for the concept of fossil fuels phase out. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, the first thing would be to clear up that the efforts in Colombia to push this agenda of phasing out are very, very strong. But these started years ago. Since the last century, the indigenous peoples have insisted and needed to leave this underground, oil underground, and they also learned about the threats for future generations. Many of the words that have been out there on how they are bleeding out the earth when they extract oil. This has been a political agenda of social processes, community processes that have been defending life in the territory and to defend the planet as well. These movements have been very persistent throughout these years and have positioned these discussions at high levels. One of the main topics of the campaign of the current president in his presidential campaign was the question that fossil fuel economy and to question the energy model towards fossil fuels. So the first thing to reflect upon these efforts is to say that there is a public agenda. We question that dependence, but we have historical files of indigenous peoples, the campesino and Afro-descendant movements, when they want to stay in their territory and relate differently with energy. Secondly, what you are aiming with that question is what happens with these efforts? Well, these efforts continue at different levels. And we have been able to position at governmental levels and also regional calls, like Gustavo Petro, the president, to protect the Amazon region. And about this issue in particular, he calls for the protection in the urgency of abandoning the fossil fuels and to have a fossil areas of free fossil fuels. This is in the context of the Amazon region and our indigenous peoples. They have different advocacy groups. Last August, we saw how in Ecuador, the population expressed themselves in defense of the Yasuni National Park. So this is a very powerful message because this can connect many fights, but at the same time, it calls for other governments to have regional agendas of areas free of fossil fuels, especially the areas of importance like Yasuni. On the other hand, the step that Colombia took the last week beyond in the alliance beyond gas and oil is coherent with these pathways with the announcements of the government. In Colombia, we've been building the diagnosis of the energy mining model. In fact, we are creating a roadmap for the energy transition. This has brought about many debates in the corporations while still in fossil fuels. They don't want to transition to another economy. They also insist in the need of moving forward in aggressive techniques like fracking and the use or exploitation of gas associated to carbon and any other techniques that may allow to extract more oil or gas, even if these are more aggressive methods. These alliances are quite necessary to make these pathways robust, to make justice, and to move forward in these alliances. And this will guarantee for Colombia to receive the support of other countries that have gained this momentum and have been able to make under a context where we require efforts. Although the agenda is so strong, but in fact, it's still very threatened. These documents that have come up as from that roadmap of energy transition also claims other scenarios of alliances. These diagnosis document as well. The Ministry of Mines and Energy mentioned that the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So I think that there are ways that we have to support at regional level and locally. There's a great and live discussion, and these transitions are not only to leave the fossil fuels. There is no technology that is going to rescue us from that unequal relations with energy or extractivism, but it is about questioning about the energy and nature. That's why the movements have been building alternatives to a social metabolism based on fossil fuels, because they are boosting community responses. So there are many efforts that are pushing to leave fossil fuels underground and that question the dependency and to see energy under this extractivist logic. This is not only about the governments. This is from the civil society standpoints and community experiences, which in the end have boosted and some part at governmental level.
Thank you so much, Louisa. It's so incredible to see the leadership right now and the conversations that are emerging with the referendum in Ecuador and the work in Colombia. You know, it's so clear that what we need is wealthy countries to act first, who have the capacity to stop the expansion, and yet we're seeing the wealthy countries doing the most expansion, and we're seeing so much leadership emerge in these difficult conversations in Latin America. Really appreciate you being with us today. The Yasuni ITT example that Louisa has raised, of course, brings to the forefront the role and leadership of Indigenous peoples from around the world for decades now, calling to keep fossil fuels in the ground, even before the groundbreaking scientific papers of 2014 in Nature, and recognizing that we need to stop expansion and that we are going to need to leave significant fossil fuel resources in the ground if we're going to meet climate goals. So Indigenous communities have been at the forefront and have led many successful efforts to constrain projects and fossil fuel infrastructure expansion and production. We are working to ensure, and we envision a fossil fuel treaty that is shaped and signed as well by Indigenous nations alongside other nations. Ariel, you are from the heart of one of the single largest fossil fuel developments on Earth, the oil sands in Alberta, Canada, and you've spent much of your life working to not only protect your nation and other Indigenous peoples from the risks of fossil fuels, but also to raise awareness of the urgency of the climate emergency and the connection between the recognition, the necessary recognition of Indigenous rights. Can you share with us a little bit about why your organization, ICA, has endorsed the call for a fossil fuel treaty and is participating as a partner organization in the initiative?
Yeah, Masicho, thank you so much. Sapporo so Eglanete, Dene Sotlaneta, Ariel Ekwe Hushe, Duranje Betsini Hesli. I just wanted to introduce myself in my language first and foremost. I'm a Dene or Dene Sotlane woman from Treaty 8 territories. And I really want to start by saying, first off, today is actually a really historically important day. Today is the 16th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it is really relevant because I have heard throughout the various presenters the important role that Indigenous peoples have had in advancing for justice, both for their communities, but for the planet, and advancing the push for the phase out and the end of a fossil fuel era and economy that has caused tremendous harms on our communities across the board. And I know that I also want to just reflect to some of the statements that Brianna had made, is that Indigenous peoples have a different way of relating to how we develop policies and procedures and governance to manage not just the community's livelihoods and well-being, but the overall relationships that we have with those lands and places, and how we come to conclusions to develop sort of collaborative and collective approaches to envisioning what a just future means. And I think that's super important that we have the Pacific Islanders that have a majority of Indigenous populations that are governing. But we also have to understand that we are still operating within colonial frameworks. despite the fact that the Pacific Islands and Tuvalu and the other Pacific Islands that have been leading this, they're still being forced to develop and construct these treaty processes within a colonial framework. And this is really important because we desperately need to phase out of fossil fuels. We desperately need the political will on all sides. But what we need, in addition to the political will from colonial governments and structures, is that we have to reconcile and reckon with the fact that we have to live within legal pluralisms. If we are to really uphold the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that means that there are other systems and governance and nations that have been largely invisibilized and ignored within these processes. And we can't just say, oh, this is a great example of how Indigenous peoples have contorted themselves into colonial frameworks and signed this treaty, but how do we move beyond that? So Indigenous climate action loves the treaty process, the fossil fuel treaty process, because we are long past the time that we're debating whether or not we need fossil fuels. I come from a community that has been inundated with fossil fuels for over 60 years. I have witnessed what it has done to our landscapes, our waterways, our air, the overall health and well-being of our ecosystems, and ultimately our communities that are suffering increased cases of cancer, autoimmune diseases, respiratory illnesses, and so on and so forth. I've also witnessed what it has done to our localized economies, completely shattering those systems and breaking apart the structures that Indigenous peoples had lived with for thousands of years prior to these industries. And I've also witnessed what it means when we don't have the political will to understand the dangers of these industries, the risks they pose on the landscapes and the Indigenous communities, and how they've used them to manipulate our communities to continue to be economic hostages within these systems and structures. If we don't have colonial and political structures that are backing a phase out of fossil fuel, it will be Indigenous communities that continue to be the sacrifice zones for colonial empires to rule and proliferate dirty fossil fuel projects, energy systems, and economies throughout the planet. We need this, and we also need to do this in tandem of uplifting the rights of Indigenous communities, the rights of land-based communities, and finding ways to marry and reconcile with the fact that this isn't just about states and governors signing the fossil fuel treaty, but how those people in those positions of power can uplift the voice and rights, not just the voice, not just a tokenized perspective, but our rights as defined within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognize us as nations. We are nations with relations and laws that are governed by our lands and territories, and it's time that we start to recognize and reconcile with how to move forward and build real climate solutions that are not contingent on predatory capitalism and fossil fuel economies. And I really, really hope we can start to build that dialogue more and start really imagining what this future looks like outside of capitalism, outside of fossil fuel economies and systems and structures, and how we can build a better future that really upholds the rights of everyone.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. I feel like it was just the mic drop, it's every time you speak, I feel like there's it's history in the making. And I think there could never be a more important time for that specific conversation, because for the last decade in the halls of the United Nations at Climate Week, we've been hearing about these market-based solutions. When we talk about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, when we talk about the connection between rights and land use and land ownership and justice, there have been this kind of pat on the head moment where people are saying, no, this is about carbon offsets, this is about credits, this is about carbon storage and sequestration. We can still expand while we decline. We can have our cake and eat it too. And I think that this year the data caught up to that false narrative that has been created, and the stories and report after report about how 80% of the offsets aren't working or aren't true, about how the carbon capture and storage facilities, just about billions of dollars, are not capturing and storing, about and now even the oil companies saying, okay, we said we would meet net zero, but actually we're not going to. We're not going to invest in renewables. We're going to invest in more production. we are in a reckoning moment, and that's what next week is about. That's what the run-up to COP28 in Dubai is about. And in that reckoning moment, we need new ideas. We can't keep making the same mistakes while people are literally today, 10,000 people in Libya washed away from their homes. And that's why this work is so important. And thank you for making those incredible connections. We are close to time, so I'm going to have to ask, sorry, Nikki and Thomas, to be very brief. But Thomas, I want to go to you now, because IEN has been working to engage other Indigenous organizations and leaders around the world on the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And in addition to that, the paramount chiefs at Tamawa Nui, the great ocean from Samoa, Tonga, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Hawaii, Vanuatu, and Fiji, have now sent an open letter to Indigenous leaders of the world calling on them to join the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Can you tell us a little bit about what IEN is doing and IEN's perspective running into this very important week next week, and your organizing around the Fossil Fuel Treaty? Thank you so much. And again, all of our panelists will be available in the coming weeks for conversations that we and our team here at Treaty will help to coordinate. I know that there are reporters on the line who may have specific questions to each of the individuals, as well as the minister who was not able to join us. So we will coordinate that with them as we move forward. So look, now more than 2,500 civil society organizations have called for a treaty. We have 6 national governments who are starting to meet together to meet with other governments from around the world in ministerials coming up on the fossil fuel treaty. And those governments and civil society are starting to put together, what are the principles of a treaty? What are the missing puzzle pieces and frameworks that we don't have in the Paris Agreement? How can we complement the Paris Agreement with a fossil fuel treaty in order to stop the expansion of fossil fuels now and manage a wind down in a way that is equitable? Nikki, I want to turn to you now because I know that you've been following this process as an international lawyer and someone who's been working on this process. Can you tell us a little bit about the principles, the fossil fuel treaty principles that have been discussed, and particularly around how do we ensure equity at the heart of the agreement so that countries with less capacity for the transition can be supported as they move away from the production and use of fossil fuels?
Sure. Thank you, Sephora, and thanks everyone for this this event and the remarks you've all offered before me. So for a just and equitable transition to a fossil-free future, we need the phase out of fossil fuels to be full, fair, fast, and funded. And I think unpacking the principles underlying those elements briefly gives some insight into how an agreement can not only help end the fossil fuel era rapidly, which is necessary as science requires, but that it delivers benefits that justice demands. So let me just address them quickly. First, the phase out has to be full, meaning comprehensive and unconditional. Any agreement has to address not just coal, but oil and gas. It's high time to abandon the lie that gas is clean or necessary. And that commitment has to be without limitation or loophole. We've seen how this language of unabated fossil fuels leaves the door open to the myth that carbon capture allows us to keep using oil and gas indefinitely. And such dangerous distractions are giving producers cover to expand operations, as that oil change report shows, and prolonging dependence and propping up demand for fossil fuel-based products like petrochemicals and plastics, which the industry is counting on to make up the lion's share of growth. But that's where the fairness of the phase out comes in. And that's where principles of equity are so essential. All countries have responsibility to curb fossil fueled climate destruction, but some clearly have more responsibility and greater capacity, namely the big polluters, the wealthy countries that have benefited the most from extraction and combustion of fossil fuels to date, and who are continuing to do so today. And I'm talking here about the United States, about Canada, about Russia, about Norway, the UK, the UAE, the countries that, as this oil change report showed so clearly, are doubling down on expanding fossil fuel production in the midst of an emergency. And it couldn't be clearer now that more fossil fuels means more loss and damage. And so the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities under international law need to be built into any agreement to ensure that those major emitters and producers are moving first and fastest, and to provide incentives using creatively trade mechanisms and support for countries that are more economically dependent to stage their phase out and to have support for alternative revenue sources, safe and sustainable jobs, and renewable energy access. Third, the phase out has to be fast, and this is crucial for equity too, because we know who's suffering most when we're not acting with that urgency. And it's unequivocal that we need to halt expansion urgently now. And if we don't stop making the products causing climate chaos, we won't stop using them. And to achieve that urgency, it's important not to replicate the flaws that we've seen in the UNFCCC process. That is, we cannot have a consensus-based approach that has impeded progress at the UNFCCC, nor can voluntary measures undermine the binding nature of an agreement. And an agreement can start small and grow, but it's got to allow for tight commitments and binding commitments and a staged approach, and only need-based extensions. Finally, the phase out and the phase out of fossil fuels and the phase in of renewables has to be funded. And this is key for equity and justice. The principle of CBDR applies not just to ensuring that polluters move fastest, but also that they pay up. The polluter pays or extractor pays principle is key to equity and justice, and the burdens of the harms that fossil fuel driven pollution has caused and the cost of that transition has to be shouldered by those who've profited from it, not those who stand in harm's way on the fence lines of facilities and the front lines of climate destruction. And there are creative mechanisms to do that, from windfall profits to shifting the subsidies that are going into the pockets of the fossil fuel industry now. I know we're running out of time. I would just flag as two critical principles: transparency that enables real participation. The fossil fuel industry can't be holding the pen when states write an agreement on managing the decline of the fossil fuel era. We've seen the risks of corporate capture of policymaking and the kinds of conflicts of interest that have been on display in these last years at the COP and this year too. And it's crucial to safeguard the ability of affected communities to have meaningful influence. the fossil fuel industry is not going to write the plan for its own decline. And finally, it's got to be right-centered and not carbon-centered. Fossil fuels are destructive not just to the climate, but to communities and the environment where they're produced and used. As Ariel was just emphasizing, you know, the health impacts of fossil fuels are tremendous. We've seen this broad endorsement of the treaty by the WHO and health professionals around the world, because air pollution from fossil fuels is killing millions alone, and that's not to say anything of the fossil fuel conflict and death. So we need we need phase out of fossil fuels, not fossil fuel emissions. That's a message that leaders at the UN and at the COP presidency need to hear loud and clear. I'll stop there because I know we're over time.
Thank you so much, Nikki. There are a couple of questions that have come in that we're able to direct in writing to specific individuals. We will be answering them. One question that came in from Arno Kopecky, recently wrote about this in the Globe and Mail, around the demands of this coming weekend's march, who it's directed at, and what's going to happen. So I did want to address that because it's just coming up. There's a global day of action that's been called for around the world to end fossil fuels in a way that is fast, fair, and forever. Those protests will be happening from the 15th to the 17th around the world. Fightfossilfuels.net is a map. You can see where things are happening. And also in New York, starting at 1 p.m. on the 17th at 56th and Broadway, a major march being organized. This is critical. We need people around the world to stand up and encourage our politicians to stand up to the oil and gas industry and coal industry and their planned expansion. The demands for those march are simple in a lot of ways. First of all, let's stop making the problem bigger. So no new fossil fuels. That means no new fossil fuel projects, finance, public or private subsidies, no new approvals, licenses, permits, or extension. A rapid and just and equitable phase out. All we're asking for, and what people around the world are asking for, is a plan to manage the decline of fossil fuel production in line with the demand destruction that we know is already happening because of the policies being put in place on electric vehicles, electrification, and because the price of renewable energy is now so cheap. If we're going to do that, to manage it in a way that is fast and equitable, then there needs to be new international cooperation. And in fact, the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty has been endorsed and is one of the key demands of the global movement's call this week. New commitments for international cooperation and scaling up financial and technology transfers, a lot like Nikki has just been speaking about. A call to stop greenwashing around offsets, carbon capture and storage, etc. Hold polluters responsible for the damage that they've caused. At this point and this moment in history, given next week, we shouldn't forget that the fossil fuel industry doubled its profits last year. The IMF just reported that governments around the world are propping up their own industries by increasing fossil fuel subsidies right now at this moment in history, $13 million a minute. So those are broadly the demands. You can see them on the link, and we look forward to seeing that around the world next week. Want to also mention before we go that there are several companion efforts underway that support the advancement of a fossil fuel treaty that are important to watch. One is the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels, which is the first time that we have a publicly available, transparent, and accountable database on who's producing what fossil fuels and how much on current, planned, and potential fossil fuel projects and the related emissions that those projects will cause. This registry will be able to be used to underpin global negotiations on who gets to produce what and how much in the future during the transition. Another important development to watch is the Global Commission of Fossil Fuels, which could conduct research and create negotiation spaces. And I'd also finally like to mention the incredible work of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is encouraging countries to put in place policies domestically to phase out oil and gas and coal. And of course, the Beyond Coal Alliance, which is doing the same for that product. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty adds the critical component of fostering international cooperation and a coordinated global just transition to those incredible initiatives around the world. Some people say or criticize that the idea of a fossil fuel treaty is too big, it's too bold. We don't have time. What we know from what we've seen this summer around the world, from the Canadian wildfires to the floods and extreme heat waves around the world to today in Libya, is that we don't have time for more of the same. What we need is leadership. What we need is imagination. And we need elected officials, especially President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in North America, where Climate Week will be held next week, to stop making the problem bigger by claiming to be climate leaders and continuing to approve new oil, gas, and coal projects. Leadership matters at this moment in history, and so does every ton of carbon, because every ton of carbon that we save from going into the atmosphere today will save lives. This couldn't be a more important moment, and I wish you all well in your work next week at the UN General Assembly and the UN Secretary General Climate Summit, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.